Chapter 15, Part 2 of New Grub Street. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bridget Gage. New Grub Street by George Gissing. Chapter 15, The Last Resource, Part 2. "Have you spoken to your mother about this?" he asked uneasily. "No, not exactly this, but I know she will help us in this way." He had seated himself and was holding her in his arms, his face laid against hers. "I shall dread to part from you, Amy. That's such a dangerous thing to do. It may mean that we are never to live as husband and wife again. But how could it? It's just to prevent that danger. If we go on here till we have no money, what's before us then? Wretched lodgings at the best. And I am afraid to think of that. I can't trust myself if that should come to pass." "What do you mean?" he asked anxiously. "I hate poverty so. It brings out all the worst things in me. You know I have told you that before, Edwin." "But you would never forget that you are my wife." "I hope not. But I can't think of it. I can't face it. That would be the very worst that can befall us, and we are going to try our utmost to escape from it. Was there ever a man who did as much as you have done in literature, and then sank into hopeless poverty?" "Oh, many." "But at your age, I mean. Surely not at your age." "I am afraid there have been such poor fellows. Think how often one hears of hopeful beginnings, new reputations, and then you hear no more. Of course, it generally means that the man has gone into a different career, but sometimes " "What?" "The abyss." He pointed downward. "Penury and despair and a miserable death." "Oh, but those men haven't a wife and child. They would struggle." "Darling, they do struggle, but it's as if an ever-increasing weight were round their necks. It drags them lower and lower. The world has no pity on a man who can't do or produce something it thinks worth money. You may be a divine poet, and if some good fellow doesn't take pity on you, you will starve by the roadside. Society is as blind and brutal as fate. I have no right to complain of my own ill fortune. It's my own fault, in a sense, that I can't continue as well as I began. If I could write books as good as the early ones, I should earn money. For all that, it's hard that I must be kicked aside as worthless just because I don't know a trade." "It shan't be. I have only to look into your face to know that you will succeed after all. Yours is the kind of face that people come to know in portraits." He kissed her hair, her eyes, and her mouth. "How well I remember your saying that before. Why have you grown so good to me all at once, my Amy? Hearing you speak like that, I feel there's nothing beyond my reach. But I dread to go away from you. If I find that it is hopeless, if I am alone somewhere and know that the effort is all in vain, then well, I can leave you free. If I can't support you, it will be only just that I should give you back your freedom." "I don't understand." She raised herself and looked into his eyes. "We won't talk of that. If you bid me go on with the struggle, I shall do so." Amy had hidden her face and lay silently in his arms for a minute or two. Then she murmured, "It's so cold in here and so late. Come." "So early. There goes 3 o'clock." The next day they talked much of this new project. As there was sunshine, Amy accompanied her husband for his walk in the afternoon. It was long since they had been out together. An open carriage that passed, followed by 2 young girls on horseback, gave a familiar direction to Reardon's thoughts. "If one were as rich as those people! They pass so close to us, they see us, and we see them, but the distance between is infinity. They don't belong to the same world as we poor wretches. They see everything in a different light. They have powers which would seem supernatural if we were suddenly endowed with them." "Of course," assented his companion with a sigh. "Just fancy, if one got up in the morning with the thought that no reasonable desire that occurred to one throughout the day need remain ungratified, and that it would be the same, any day and every day, to the end of one's life. Look at those houses, every detail, within and without, luxurious. To have such a home as that!" "And they are empty creatures who live there." "They do live, Amy, at all events. Whatever may be their faculties, they have all free scope. I have often stood staring at houses like these until I couldn't believe that the people owning them were mere human beings like myself. The power of money is so hard to realize. One who has never had it marvels at the completeness with which it transforms every detail of life. Compare what we call our home with that of rich people. It moves one to scornful laughter. I have no sympathy with the stoical point of view. Between wealth and poverty is just the difference between the whole man and the maimed. If my lower limbs are paralyzed, I may still be able to think, but then there is such a thing in life as walking. As a poor devil, I may live nobly, but one happens to be made with faculties of enjoyment, and those have to fall into atrophy. To be sure, most rich people don't understand their happiness. If they did, they would move and talk like gods, which indeed they are. Amy's brow was shadowed. A wise man, in Reardon's position, would not have chosen this subject to dilate upon. "The difference," he went on, "between the man with money and the man without is simply this. The one thinks, 'How shall I use my life?' And the other, 'How shall I keep myself alive?' A physiologist ought to be able to discover some curious distinction between the brain of a person who has never given a thought to the means of subsistence, and that of one who has never known a day free from such cares. There must be some special cerebral development representing the mental anguish kept up by poverty." "I should say," put in Amy, "that it affects every function of the brain. It isn't a special point of suffering, but a misery that colours every thought." "True. Can I think of a single subject in all the sphere of my experience without the consciousness that I see it through the medium of poverty? I have no enjoyment which isn't tainted by that thought, and I can suffer no pain which it doesn't increase. The curse of poverty is to the modern world just what that of slavery was to the ancient. Rich and destitute stand to each other as freeman and bond. You remember the line of Homer I have often quoted about the demoralizing effect of enslavement. Poverty degrades in the same way. It has had its effect upon me. I know that too well," said Amy, with bitter frankness. Reardon glanced at her and wished to make some reply, but he could not say what was in his thoughts. He worked on at his story. Before he had reached the end of it, Margaret Home was published, and one day arrived a parcel containing the 6 copies to which an author is traditionally entitled. Reardon was not so old in authorship that he could open the packet without a slight flutter of his pulse. The book was tastefully got up. Amy exclaimed with pleasure as she caught sight of the cover and lettering. "It may succeed, Edwin. It doesn't look like a book that fails, does it?" She laughed at her own childishness. But Reardon had opened one of the volumes and was glancing over the beginning of a chapter. "Good God!" he cried. "What hellish torment it was to write that page! I did it one morning when the fog was so thick that I had to light the lamp. It brings cold sweat to my forehead to read the words. And to think that people will skim over it without a suspicion of what it cost the writer. What execrable style! A pot boy could write better narrative. Who are to have copies?" "No one, if I can help it. But I suppose your mother will expect one." "And Milvain?" "I suppose so," he replied indifferently, "but not unless he asks for it. Poor old Biffen, of course, though it'll make him despise me. Then one for ourselves. That leaves 2, to light the fire with. We have been rather short of fire paper since we couldn't afford our daily newspaper." "Will you let me give one to Mrs. Carter?" "As you please." He took one set and added it to the row of his productions, which stood on a topmost shelf. Amy laid her hand upon his shoulder and contemplated the effect of this addition. "The works of Edwin Reardon," she said, with a smile. "The work, at all events. Rather a different thing, unfortunately. Amy, if only I were back at the time when I wrote On Neutral Ground, and yet had you with me. How full my mind was in those days! Then I had only to look, and I saw something. Now I strain my eyes, but can make out nothing more than nebulous grotesques. I used to sit down knowing so well what I had to say. Now I strive to invent, and never come at anything. Suppose you pick up a needle with warm, supple fingers. Try to do it when your hand is stiff and numb with cold. There's the difference between my manner of work in those days and what it is now." "But you are going to get back your health. You will write better than ever." "We shall see. Of course there was a great deal of miserable struggle even then, but I remember it as insignificant compared with the hours of contented work. I seldom did anything in the mornings except think and prepare. Towards evening I felt myself getting ready, and at last I sat down with the first lines buzzing in my head. And I used to read a great deal at the same time. Whilst I was writing On Neutral Ground, I went solidly through the Divina Commedia, a canto each day. Very often I wrote till after midnight, but occasionally I got my quantum finished much earlier, and then I used to treat myself to a ramble about the streets. I can recall exactly the places where some of my best ideas came to me. You remember the scene in Prendergast's lodgings? That flashed on me late one night as I was turning out of Leicester Square into the slum that leads to Clare Market. Ah, how well I remember! And I went home to my garret in a state of delightful fever, and scribbled notes furiously before going to bed. Don't trouble, it'll all come back to you. But in those days I hadn't to think of money. I could look forward and see provision for my needs. I never asked myself what I should get for the book. I assure you that never came into my head, never. The work was done for its own sake. No hurry to finish it. If I felt that I wasn't up to the mark, I just waited till the better mood returned. On neutral ground took me 7 months. Now I have to write 3 volumes in 9 weeks, with the lash stinging on my back if I miss a day." He brooded for a little. "I suppose there must be some rich man somewhere who has read 1 or 2 of my books with a certain interest. If only I could encounter him and tell him plainly what a cursed state I am in, perhaps he will help me to some means of earning a couple of pounds a week. One has heard of such things." "In the old days." "Yes. I doubt if it ever happens now. Coleridge wouldn't so easily meet with his Gilman nowadays. Well, I am not a Coleridge, and I don't ask to be lodged under any man's roof. But if I could earn money enough to leave me good long evenings, unspoilt by the fear of the workhouse." Amy turned away, and presently went to look after her little boy. A few days after this they had a visit from Milvain. He came about 10 o'clock in the evening. "I'm not going to stay," he announced. "But where's my copy of Margaret home? I am to have one, I suppose." "I have no particular desire that you should read it," returned Reardon. "But I have read it, my dear fellow. Got it from the library on the day of publication. I had a suspicion that you wouldn't send me a copy, but I must possess your opera omnia. Here it is. Hide it away somewhere. You may as well sit down for a few minutes." "I confess I should like to talk about the book, if you don't mind. It isn't so utterly and damnably bad as you make out, you know. The misfortune was that you had to make 3 volumes of it. If I had leave to cut it down to 1, it would do you credit. The motive is good enough." "Yes, just good enough to show how badly it's managed." Milvain began to expatiate on that well-worn topic, the evils of the 3-volume system. "A triple-headed monster, sucking the blood of English novelists. One might design an allegorical cartoon for a comic literary paper. By the by, why doesn't such a thing exist? A weekly paper treating of things and people literary in a facetious spirit. It would be caviare to the general, but might be supported, I should think. The editor would probably be assassinated, though." "For any one in my position," said Reardon, "how is it possible to abandon the 3 volumes? It is a question of payment. An author of moderate repute may live on a yearly 3-volume novel. I mean the man who is obliged to sell his book out and out, and who gets from £1 to £200 for it. But he would have to produce 4 1-volume novels to obtain the same income, and I doubt whether he could get so many published within the 12 months. And here comes in the benefit of the libraries. From the commercial point of view, the libraries are indispensable. Do you suppose the public would support the present number of novelists if each book had to be purchased? A sudden change to that system would throw 3/4 of the novelists out of work." "But there's no reason why the libraries shouldn't circulate novels in 1 volume." "Profits would be less, I suppose. People would take the minimum subscription." "Well, to go to the concrete, what about your own 1 volume?" "All but done." "And you'll offer it to Jedwood? Go and see him personally. He's a very decent fellow, I believe." Milvain stayed only half an hour. The days when he was wont to sit and talk at large through a whole evening were no more, partly because of his diminished leisure, but also for a less simple reason, the growth of something like estrangement between him and Reardon. "You didn't mention your plans," said Amy, when the visitor had been gone some time. "No." Reardon was content with the negative, and his wife made no further remark. The result of advertising the flat was that 2 or 3 persons called to make inspection. One of them, a man of military appearance, showed himself anxious to come to terms. He was willing to take the tenement from the next quarter day, June, but wished, if possible, to enter upon possession sooner than that. "Nothing could be better," said Amy, in colloquy with her husband. "If he will pay for the extra time, we shall be only too glad." Reardon mused and looked gloomy. He could not bring himself to regard the experiment before him with hopefulness. and his heart sank at the thought of parting from Amy. "You are very anxious to get rid of me," he answered, trying to smile. "Yes, I am!" she exclaimed, "but simply for your own good, as you know very well. Suppose I can't sell this book? You will have a few pounds. Send your Pliny article to the wayside. If you come to an end of all your money, mother shall lend you some." "I am not very likely to do much work in that case." "Oh, but you will sell the book. You'll get 20 pounds for it, and that alone would keep you for 3 months. Think, 3 months of the best part of the year at the seaside. Oh, you will do wonders." The furniture was to be housed at Mrs Yule's. Neither of them durst speak of selling it. That would have sounded too ominous. As for the locality of Reardon's retreat, Amy herself had suggested Worthing, which she knew from a visit a few years ago. The advantages were its proximity to London, and the likelihood that very cheap lodgings could be found either in the town or near it. One room would suffice for the hapless author, and his expenses, beyond a trifling rent, would be confined to mere food. Oh yes, he might manage on considerably less than £1 a week. Amy was in much better spirits than for a long time. She appeared to have convinced herself that there was no doubt of the issue of this perilous scheme, that her husband would write a notable book, receive a satisfactory price for it, and so re-establish their home. Yet her moods varied greatly. After all, there was delay in the letting of the flat, and this caused her annoyance. It was whilst the negotiations were still pending that she made her call upon Maud and Dora Milvain. Reardon did not know of her intention to visit them until it had been carried out. She mentioned what she had done in almost a casual manner. "I had to get it over," she said, when Reardon exhibited surprise, "and I don't think I made a very favourable impression." "You told them, I suppose, what we are going to do?" "No, I didn't say a word of it." "But why not? It can't be kept a secret. Milvain will have heard of it already, I should think, from your mother." "From mother? But it's the rarest thing for him to go there. Do you imagine he is a constant visitor? I thought it better to say nothing until the thing is actually done. Who knows what may happen?" She was in a strange, nervous state, and Reardon regarded her uneasily. He talked very little in these days, and passed hours in dark reverie. His book was finished, and he awaited the publisher's decision. Chapter 15